Hello and good afternoon everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today that is going to be focusing on simplifying security in a hybrid and multi-cloud world. So just before I pass over, so we are joined here today by Mark Nunnikhoven, who's the Vice President of Cloud Research at Trend Micro. He will be going through the webinar with you today.
Perfect. I'll just pull up my screen. Thank you very, very much, Amy. Much appreciated. And you should be able to see the slides now. So we're going to talk about security in a hybrid or a multi-cloud world. My name, as Amy said, is Mark Nunnikhoven. I am the VP of Cloud Research at Trend Micro. You can reach me online at Twitter at MarkNCA. For those of you that are watching this webinar live, we do have questions available. If it's something pertinent to what I'm talking about in the moment, don't be shy, fire away. For those of you who are watching on demand, you can retroactively ask the question or bother me about something or disagree, whatever. Hit me up on Twitter at MarkNCA. Always love to discuss this area because I think it's a real and relevant challenge for a lot of organizations today trying to deal with multiple clouds, hybrid cloud. It's basically a mess. So as we dive into this, let's make sure we're all on the same page. I want to talk about the problem, and let's define this problem so that we're starting from that common ground. So this is kind of what you're dealing with today. A lot of people have this mix of environments. So on the right-hand side here, you see you've got some physical systems. You've still got those legacy systems that, you kind of sit in the rack of shame in the corner of your data center estate, and nobody's really sure how they've kept up this long, but, the lights are still on, so it's good. And then the majority of your assets on premise are probably virtualized at this point. So whether that's using VMware or Hyper-V or Xen, you're predominantly virtualized within your data center estate. But now you're also starting to move out into the cloud. So when you're spinning up new servers, you're maybe going to Microsoft Azure or to AWS or to Google Cloud, IBM, any number of these providers that are at global scale. And now you have to sort of reconcile how you deal with security in a reasonable way across all of these environments. Though you might have a plan in place to start migrating into the cloud, and that's something you also have to consider as well, because most of us have realized at this point that for our day-to-day business, there's really no competitive advantage to be managing things like Windows or Linux, right? Unless you're in an IT delivery business, that's not an advantage for you. If you're a food retailer or financial services, or maybe you're in a traditional clothing retail or something like that, that's your business. Your business isn't running Windows. So you're going to try to migrate into the cloud. But there's a few things that are going to get in your way. And you need to be aware of these to plan into the strategy for securing all these environments. So anything in your virtual estate is very movable into the cloud. It's very simple. It's the same concept. The difference here is the cloud provider is running the virtualization layer, but you take over at the operating system and go from there. It's very, very simple to get done. The physical stuff, you have to consider its life cycle. You've already made an investment in this physical equipment. You don't want to throw it out. You want to get the maximum amount of value you can out of that. And that's less of a concern with servers, but it's a significant concern when it comes to network switching equipment, legacy data center infrastructure. That's expensive stuff. And if you've already made that investment, you want to maximize it. Then, of course, the legacy stuff, you kind of need to keep running until it stops, because it's been going this long. This is the mainframe stuff. This is the box with cobwebs on it, and you just kind of hope and pray that it keeps up a little bit longer until you can get a better strategy. But of course, that's not the end of it, because now you're also using services as well, right? So we need to figure out this challenge. And that really boils down into two major areas here. We have a large number of services that we're going to be using. So this is both in the cloud, on-premise, as well as software services, anything you can think of. We've got a lot of different services that we need to account for. And of course, that's going to lead to the commensurate amount of a large number of controls. So these are not just security controls, but this applies equally to operations as well. So how do we account for these things? Well, let's start to dive in by looking at the number of services. Okay, so we'll isolate this and we'll see just how many services we have to deal with. Now, there is a lot of information out there. You'll see a lot of different marketing slides from different companies about how many services are in play. There's a lot of different surveys that have been done, and realistically, between the spectrum of using no cloud services or using every cloud service on the planet, the best number I can give you, or the best answer I can give you to how many services is your organization using is lots. Very scientific. I always feel bad kind of showing this slide because I am a scientific researcher and it's really a challenge when you can't put a number to things, but there's so much variety here. The only common denominator is that a lot of people or a lot of organizations are using a lot of services. So you can be very confident in saying that your organization is using more than a couple cloud services. These are things very overtly like AWS or Azure where you're spinning up virtual servers, but it's also the other things like Office 365 or Dropbox or BoxNet or Salesforce. All these things are cloud services, and you need to account for those. And even extending further, some traditional stuff would fall under this kind of service model where you're getting something from a partner, right? Or maybe from your regional branch and you're getting something from central. These are all services that we need to account for. So we know you're using a lot of them. So now the challenge is, how many controls are we using? We've probably got a lot of controls in play. And the good news here is that regardless of where your services are sitting, they all are going to work under the same model. And that model is called the shared responsibility model. And if you understand the shared responsibility model, you understand how the client or consumer provider relationship, the user and provider relationship is going to work. And the good news here is this is a model you're already using today internally. It's just when it works with an external provider, things get a little bit different. But you can see on the left-hand side, if we start with infrastructure as a service, we move all the way over to the right-hand side on the slide, which is software as a service. And there are 6 major areas where there's day-to-day responsibilities for operations and for security. And these 6 areas are constant across all service types. The difference is where the line gets drawn for who's responsible for what. So if we start with infrastructure as a service, because most people are really comfortable with the idea of getting a server from somebody, when I ask Google for a server or Microsoft or AWS or IBM, I get the same scenario here. They will take care of the physical security and operations, so I don't have to worry about where that data center is outside of a vague geographic allocation for GDPR and other regulations. But I don't have to worry about, it's at a specific address, and I don't have to worry about the power and the cooling in that building. I don't have to worry about the network interconnects. I don't have to worry about the virtualization layer. That's all taken care of by the cloud service provider, right? That's the advantage of getting this service. I don't want to be in that business. They are very good at that business, so it's a good deal. But where you need to take over is at the operating system level. So you need to make sure that you're locking down Windows or Linux just like you do in the data center. You need to make sure that you're updating your applications and that the data that's going into this system is appropriate for the level of controls that you've put in place. So it's a very common thing. You do that today within your organization where you probably have one team or multiple teams that run the data center itself, and you probably have a Windows or Linux team that runs the operating system and an application team, and then the business unit's putting the data in. So this is a relationship that you're using today. The difference is the virtualization infrastructure physical is now by a third party when it comes to the cloud. So most people are comfortable working in this model, and of course, as you move over to different types of services that get more abstract, so platform as a service, think something like Salesforce.com or Google's App Engine, you don't have access to the operating system, so that's the service provider's responsibility. And then you move up to software as a service, so something like Gmail or Office 365, you don't have access to even the application. You just get to decide what data goes in and out. And common across all 3 modes of delivery is that you need to also understand the configuration options that you've been given by the provider. So for something like Office 365, you can still do user access, right? You can control which users have access to which documents, which users have access to the service. Those are up to you to configure. And when it comes to things like virtual servers, you can configure the firewall around them, so you can open that up to the world if you want to. Security pro tip, never do that. That's a horrible, horrible idea. But you can within a cloud service provider situation because it's your responsibility. But that's the kind of thing you need to understand in this dynamic, in the shared responsibility model. Very well named, very easy to understand once you see it laid out like this. So with that in play, we now can look at the types of security controls we're going to need to put in place. And you'll notice if we start with infrastructure as a service, these are the controls we're used to today on-premise. And that's a key to securing in hybrid cloud and multi-cloud, is that infrastructure as a service is very similar to data center security today. The difference is things like IDS and IPS are now going to be on the host, on the virtual machine within the cloud, because that's where you control, whereas in the data center environment, those are the types of things that you're going to put on the perimeter because you own the perimeter. But all of these controls you see here, integrity monitoring, access controls, content filtering, this is stuff we deal with every day. We're familiar with it. The only difference when it moves to cloud services is that where it sits in your design is going to be different. The fact that it exists is the same. You need a bit of a different technology to implement it because it is in a different place. You're not going to be shipping a hardware box to the cloud service provider and asking them to install it. That's not going to happen. So you need a software-based solution instead. When it comes to platform as a service, now we're starting to get a little bit different because we don't have access to the operating system, right? So now we have to consider things like CASB. It's a Cloud Access Security Broker. This is basically like a security proxy service. It's going to leverage the APIs and the platform service offering, and it's going to add security controls on top of it. So things like anti-malware or sandboxing or data loss prevention. These types of things are going to come through that Cloud Access Security Broker. You're also going to really worry about your secure design now. Obviously, that's something you should be concerned about anywhere, but within a platform as a service, that's the major thing you have control over, is that you can decide which pieces of the platform you're using. And so if I'm building something like a financial forecasting model, if I'm building that within Salesforce, I know that I want to lock that down using the access control features that the platform provides. I also know that, you know, the data that I'm storing, I want to make sure that that's encrypted on the back end, and I want to select the appropriate options on that platform to do that. So it's a little bit different when you move to platform as a service. Pushing all the way over to the most abstract services we use, again, to the SaaS services, so things like Office 365, Gmail, Dropbox, BoxNet, that kind of stuff. Now we're almost entirely hands-off. We still have the option of using a Cloud Access Security Broker. Again, it's that intelligent security proxy that's going to integrate with the APIs that are available. But again, now that control is completely reliant on what the cloud service provider is offering access to through the APIs. So if you take an example of Office 365, they have a full file access API, so you can integrate things like additional malware scanning or sandboxing or data loss prevention and intrusion detection and some basic controls through a Cloud Access Security Broker. But if you take a competitor like the new Dropbox Paper option, there's not as a robust API there. You can do some basic content scanning, but it's not as deeply hooked in. So you are very much reliant on the service provider to open up access to actually put in a technical control. So where you're going to spend a lot of your time is, you know, making sure that your Cloud Access Security Broker lines up with the service you're using, but also you want to start educating the users so that they firmly understand what types of data is okay to store in these services. So if you're comfortable with the risk that has proprietary IP for your company, so maybe, you know, your secret sauce recipe, you're okay with that going into the cloud service that you've chosen for collaboration, then that's great. But if you're not, you need to make sure that your employees and your teams are well educated and and they understand that, you know, here's a great tool for collaboration, but you really shouldn't be putting this type of secret data, you know, the company's crown jewels into this service. Coordinating meetings, forecasting reports, stuff like that's fine, but never ever put that secret sauce recipe in there. So that's an overview of sort of the controls that are in there. And the good news here is that most people, you know, as I'm listing these controls out, we're talking about them, they're pretty familiar with everything. And the only new area here is that CASB, that Cloud Access Security Broker, but even that's a similar concept to outbound content filtering, right? A security proxy in your data center. Very, very similar. The difference here is it's hooking into APIs instead of monitoring internet traffic. So you already understand the concept, even if the acronym and the name is new to you. The challenge we really have, though, is that when you look around to your business and you look around to the teams that are working on stuff, they are adopting cloud services faster than we are looking at and adopting security tools, or faster than security tools are being developed. It's really, really hard to keep up with this pace of change. And that's a very interesting area for me. I've been researching it the last few years, working with organizations around the globe, because we start to get out of the technology realm and start to talk about team dynamics. We start to talk about process, about workflow. We're going to cover a bit of that coming up here in this webinar, because I think it's important for us to discuss that. The technology side, it turns out, is actually the easy part. It's the people side that's really, really a challenge. So the fundamental question, now that we've framed that problem and we've got a good understanding of what we're trying to tackle, our fundamental problem is how do we manage security for all these services? And if you take that question sort of to the next logical step, how do we manage it in the most efficient way possible and avoid duplicating, triplicating, replicating, and having a multitude of different security controls and processes for the multitude of services that we're adopting? Remember, we had agreed that we're all using lots of services, at least more than a couple. For every service you onboard, you don't want to add a whole new set of security controls. You don't want to add a whole new set of processes, but there needs to be some adaptation on your part so that you are flexible enough to onboard these services and apply the right controls at the right time. So where are we now? And this is a really interesting question because it depends on the maturity of your organization, and it depends on the familiarity you have with the cloud service adoption within your organization, and more importantly, it's the relationship that you have with the business units that are adopting these services. It continues to amaze me how many times I will go to very, very large organizations with rather mature IT organizations, departments within them, and they're still surprised at the amount of cloud adoption that they've got internally, because business units, it does not take an IT procurement cycle to go out and sign up for a cloud service, right? We've all done it in our personal lives. You've probably done it more than once for work as well. You just need a credit card, and 5 seconds later, you're signed up for the latest and greatest new service. And that's a wonderful thing for business enablement and speed of innovation. As a security person, you kind of start to cringe and you get a little freaked out because that means your data is in one more place and it hasn't been vetted and you have no idea as to what's going on. So where are we now is actually a really relevant question with some upsides and a really scary sort of possibility. But essentially, if we look at our organization as follows, so for the organization at the bottom, we've probably got some virtual machines running in infrastructure as a service somewhere. You can also count this as your data center or multiple data centers as well, because we can treat them the same. We know they use the same types of security controls. They're just deployed in different actual locations. And then you might have some platform as a service. A lot of companies move their ERP systems or their CRM systems over to platform as a service because the vendors have realized it's far more efficient for them to deploy as services versus shipping you code all the time and trying to keep it up to date because of the complexity of the systems. And then inevitably there's probably a bunch of SaaS services that are kicking around. Most people are using some sort of document collaboration, so whether that's Google Apps or Office 365 or some other alternative. And normally there's one or more, normally more, file sharing services in use. So a lot of teams will be using Dropbox and some will be using Box.net. Others will be using Google Drive and or OneDrive. There's a multitude of these services out there because they are so useful. And ideally, you'd like to have sort of one security point for each service type. Unfortunately, that isn't the reality. So what ends up happening is if you're lucky, and this is sort of the best case scenario today, you'll have unique controls for each service that you're using. So if you're using multiple platform services, you'll have multiple security controls in place because you'll sort of customize it for each. Or maybe you were super, super lucky and the business unit actually signed up and put some security in place when they onboarded that service. When it comes to SaaS services, it tends to be even worse because a lot of the time your business units or even your IT teams aren't actually deploying any additional security or aren't doing security reviews of the SaaS services. So while you'd like to think you have unique controls for each service that you've onboarded, realistically you probably have unique controls for maybe half of them, and then the absolutely sort of security perspective terrifying situation where you have no controls in place for the other half of services that you're using, which is obviously a significant concern, especially given the regulatory environments in which we're all working. You need to know where your data is and how it's protected at all times. So we need to figure out how we can rectify this situation and make it a little more reasonable for us. So let's talk strategy. We understand the problem. We understand where we are now. What are some strategies that we can use to get a handle on this and really take security to the next level? Because the cloud, for me, is a very interesting place because it enables some really advanced cutting-edge security scenarios, but it takes a mature security program and a mature organization to get there. So what's a strategy we can put in place to deal with multi-cloud, to deal with hybrid cloud, to deal with all of these services that we know our organization is taking advantage of, and that we in fact want to encourage our organization to take advantage of? Because one of the things that people understand or start to understand when it comes to the shared responsibility model is if your cloud service provider or partner organization is taking on more of the day-to-day responsibilities, that means you're taking on less of them, which means you can focus and do a better job and go deeper on the areas you are responsible for, and that's a huge win, right? If you no longer have to worry about the day-to-day security and operations of an operating system, so you no longer have to worry about Patch Tuesdays, you no longer have to worry about hardening these things and locking them down because you've offloaded that to a provider or a partner, now you can focus deeply on your application and its design and its security, and that's a huge win. So let's talk this strategy through and let's see where we need to tackle the different areas in order to be really effective and not add extra work for ourselves. So for me, successful security starts with 3 Ps, and it starts with 3 Ps because I guess I've been working with the marketing folks for too long because it's catchy. It's easy to say 3 Ps, and those 3 Ps end up converting into very 3 main areas that you want to focus on. So the first P is people. It's always people. If people are not your #1 priority in your security posture, in your security program, it's time to take a real hard look at what you're trying to accomplish and whether or not you're effective in providing security to your organization, because people are critical. This is not just people on your security team, as you'll discover really quickly. I have some very strong opinions about the security team itself, but this is everybody in your organization. We all can agree that security is everybody's responsibility, but we as a security experts, as security professionals, need to ensure that we're educating everybody within the organization as to what the security impacts of their actions are and what the challenges of the environment they're working in. So people are absolutely critical. The second P is process. Right? Nobody likes process. Process is super, super boring, but it's really, really important because process gives people a framework in which to repeat actions, right? So computers have a beautiful advantage in that, you give them a file full of code and they will faithfully execute that code almost every single time over millions of iterations in the exact same way, right? There's very little variability. Process is what helps people try to accomplish the same thing. Right, so if you have a process or if you want to set up a new server, there should be a process around that, and that process is, the checklist or the run book to make sure that it's done consistently and easily and repeatably, and that you can learn from every successive move forward. So process helps frame people and helps sort of accelerate them and keep them going consistent. And finally, the last segment of security. So you notice we focused on people first. Process is next important, and then after that it's products or technology. And products is handy because it's a P, but this could very easily be technology or open source or whatever the case may be. But the products and the tools that you're deploying within your organization for security should help implement the process and reinforce and amplify the ability of the people. So it's very, very simple. Remember 3 Ps. It's people first, process to support those people, products to support the process. So you notice I keep emphasizing people because I don't think we put enough focus on everybody within our organization. So that's what successful security is. And with that in mind, here's how we're going to lay out a strategy to simplify security in this new world, in this multiple environment world. The first thing we're going to focus on is actually our security folks. And you'll notice this guy's a little grumpy. we tend to have that reputation. As security professionals, we tend to be the grumpy Gus, the Chicken Little, everything is a disaster. There is no middle ground with security folks traditionally, right? And that's a bad thing because we need to be working together. You'll see why as we get into the tactics stage, why security needs to stop being isolated, why we need to be a core part of the business. And that starts with the individual security practitioners. And we're also going to need new sets of skills to deal with these environments. And again, you're going to see this reinforced in the tactics section. But a security specialist nowadays is going to need to have a basic understanding of how to do development. Right? You're going to be working closely with developers. You're going to be working closely with operations folks. You need to understand what they're worried about, what they're concerned about, and you need the ability to write code. You don't have to be a deep, senior engineer on this respect, but you need to be able to string together some simple calls to make sure that you can get data into a system and data out of a system, because the only way security is successful moving forward is if it's automated. And you can't constantly rely on somebody else to be doing this automation. It needs to be built from within the team. So this is a new core skill that you're going to need for your security specialist. Think of it as reading and writing, right? If you can't code and understand the development practices, you are basically illiterate within this new world. So you need to have a strong base in this. And then a big push here and a big change to the traditional environment is they need to be able to put users first. Right? It's not that attitude of the users, it's the user's fault. My personal pet peeve, and it's best practice with big quotes around that, and that's the disadvantage of this webinar because I don't have a webcam on me right now, is think giant air quotes when you say best practice around this, because we all teach our users when it comes to something like phishing. Right? We tell them, don't click on links. And then when somebody gets malware through a phish, we go, oh man, they clicked on that link, the user shouldn't have done that. Well, guess what? I've got news for you. The link is built from the ground up to let users click on it. That is the sole purpose of a link, is to let users click. And then we get mad because they click on it, right? We need to give them better tools. We need to give them a better understanding of what's going on. That's absolutely critical. You need to put the user first. Then you need a basic understanding or a perspective around practical security. So this is putting things very much in the context of the business. You can't just say, this is the worst vulnerability ever, we need to patch it right now. You need to understand how to relate that to the business to make sure that they are understanding it, right? They don't need to know about the latest threat or the really cool exploit that you saw happening. They need to know that, if we don't do this now, there is a very real risk that our IT systems will be down and we won't be able to process orders. And then the last point for a new security specialist in the new world here is that you're very much an educator. You need to get out there and educate the rest of your business as to why security is a priority concern. Now, to do that, we need to break down how teams are built right now. And I told you this was going to get out of our comfort zone, but I think it's important that you hang in there and you understand that we have teams that are set up that are completely isolated. Security is its own team. We say security is everybody's responsibility, but then we set up a security team of 5 to 10 or maybe 20 people, and they're completely isolated on their own, answering up to their own, to the CISO, and they try to work with everybody but from afar. Well, we need to adjust that, and give full credit. This was actually something I saw at a usability conference. Peter Merholtz and Kristen Skinner wrote a book with O'Reilly, designing or organizational design for design orgs, and they had a really good idea. And they basically said, specific to usability folks, but it's just as applicable to security, was that you can't stand alone. You need to be integrated. So they said if you've got dev teams, so we have 3 dev teams here with the green dots, and we have some more dev teams and some more dev teams, you should be embedding security specialists in each of working with a couple of these teams each. So instead of being completely isolated, you're embedding the security expertise directly in the people who are making and running your applications. That's absolutely critical. And then you get the security folks to talk to each other, right? So now that's how you're enforcing things consistently and you're getting a good view of the organization. But we can't stand alone anymore. We need to work directly and deeply with our colleagues in the rest of IT, and that makes everybody happy, as you can see from the little guys, the little bottoms on the screen, right? We need to be included, and the first step to that is getting in there. Now, I know that's not something people are going to be able to do right away. Organizational change takes time. So here's a couple quick bridges that you can do. Get a budget for coffee and start taking somebody new out for coffee every morning. As a security professional, you go and you say, hey, Joe from development, come on out, and you talk next day you go, Francine, do you want to grab a coffee for 10 minutes? And you just keep speaking to people and building those bridges. Coffee is an amazing thing. It's a super inexpensive, or it's a super cheap way, a couple bucks a day or a couple pounds a day, and you're going to start to build these bridges within the teams. Also doing some job shadowing and doing direct teaching. So helping explain things in context, that's going to start building those bridges and make it easier. Now, you're probably sitting here going, why are we listening to making teams? I thought this was about technology, and I thought this was about making your life easier in a hybrid and a multi-cloud world. And it is. Because what you're going to see is that the requirements around our technology need us to be there from day one. We can't bolt on security and think it's going to be successful when it comes to the cloud, because things just simply move too fast. So we need to change our position within the organization to make sure that we can be successful. Because one of the areas we're looking at right now is if we have multiple controls, things are going to get out of hand really, really quickly, right? You won't be able to keep up. And you will end up having to hire more staff or complain that you need more staff and never get the resources, because I think one thing that is common across the world, I have yet to meet an IT security director or a VP or manager who thinks they have enough team and enough budget. So what we need to start looking at from a technology selection perspective in our strategy is make sure that we have multi-service controls. So you can no longer get a control that only does one service or one thing for one service. The good news here for infrastructure as a service, that means we can get one platform that's going to cover infrastructure as a service for multiple cloud providers, whether it's Azure, AWS, or Google, or someone else. Also cover our virtual environment, our physical, and our legacy stuff, right? So we can handle one platform, can easily take care of that. There are a few options out there. You can brew your own, but that's where you want to be shooting for, is multi-service controls. Infrastructure is pretty straightforward. PaaS is where this is super weak, just the nature of PaaS. It's basically, a box of Lego bricks, and you get to build something. It's really hard to get consistent security across those, so you're probably still going to be buying one-offs when it comes to that. But for SaaS, for software services, right, you can go to a multi-SaaS CASB, so a multi-SaaS cloud access security broker. There's quite a few offerings out there, again, that will let you cover both Dropbox and BoxNet and Google Drive from the same one, Office 365, all that, so you don't have to deploy a different broker for every single service. So very much focus is multi-service controls, because every single tool you add is adding overhead to your team and to your organization, and that's a bad thing, right? We want to reduce overhead. We want to be more efficient. The second strategic area we want to look when it comes to technology is programmable. Everything needs to be programmable. That's why I said we need to change our skill set so that we're comfortable with basic code and scripting, because every tool we're buying, whether it's for the data center or the cloud, should have an API or be scriptable. It should do things like scaling up and down automatically. It needs to be very familiar and comfortable with a dynamic environment. And it needs to be able to integrate with other tools, because guess what? Every other team is the same way. They don't want to onboard more tools. And if they need to read the output from a security control or a security platform, they don't want to log into that platform. They want that output in their own tool. So developers, very popular using things like Slack, they want security information in Slack because that's where all their build information and all their bug information is sitting. They don't want to log into another platform. So programmable is absolutely key. Multi-service controls that are programmable is how we're going to approach onboarding new tech. Because automation is going to give us that speed, that scale, that consistency that we're looking for, that we absolutely actually need when it comes to this new hybrid and multi-cloud world. That's going to lead us into some tactics. So we know our strategy. We need to be friendlier security folks. We need to be closer to the business. We know we want multi-service controls. We know we need programmability within those controls. How do we put that into play? Well, we knew our multi-service outlook, right? We saw that earlier on. What we want to do is cover a few areas here. We want to, first of all, reduce our exposure. This is some more soft skills work, right? So this is a tactic you can start doing right now. You want to make sure that you're educating and running awareness campaigns for the business units who are selecting these services. You want them to be aware of the risks, aware very much right now of GDPR and the regulatory environment, so that they're not picking services that are completely outside of the scope of regulation. You want a strong policy in place. The good news here is the Cloud Security Alliance has the CCM, the Cloud Control Matrix. It's an excellent document in a number of revisions down the road already, which gives you a very good idea of what controls you should be looking for in what area. It's vendor agnostic, it's vendor neutral, so it's very a good thing to start with as sort of your base for your policy around security in the cloud and in hybrid cloud. And you also want to make sure that your IT services are fully responsive. One of the major drivers for units to go outside to cloud services is because they can't get service internally, right? Or service takes too long. So if your internal IT services takes a day to spin up a virtual machine, I guarantee you that business unit is never going to ask twice, because they can go out to AWS or Google or Microsoft and get 1,000 servers in under a minute with just a credit card, right? So very responsive IT services. These are things you want to work for to help reduce your overall exposure. Second thing you want to set up, and this is the biggest technical tactic that you can implement right now, is centralized monitoring. So this is where, again, that scriptability, that programmability comes into play. You want to make sure that you're getting all of the operational information from all the multitude of services, whether they're on-prem with a partner, in a cloud, in a different cloud, SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, whatever. You need to pull all this data into a central place. The good news, where 10 years ago this was a big challenge because you had to worry about SAN space internally, SIM licensing, all this kind of stuff, there are wonderful cloud services out there, the ability to spin up your own for very, very low cost that are highly effective. Do not roll your own internally anymore. It is not cost effective. It is too much of a time sink and a cost sink. Where you should be spending your time and money is on making sure that you can normalize all this data, because there are some SaaS services that won't give you a lot of operational eventing information. You'll get some really basic stuff where you'll have to pull for it. Where looking at infrastructure services where you have full access to the operating system, you can get a constant flow of information. So failed Windows logins, event updates, a whole bunch of stuff that we're used to. So that's where you want to be spending your time, is making sure that all of that comes together. Sort of a lowest common denominator for centralized monitoring. But if you pick one thing and only one thing to take away from this webinar, centralized monitoring is something that will pay back your investment exponentially. Get that rolling as fast as you can and make it as easy as possible for new services that come on board to start sending their data to a central place, or for that central place to pull data in from those services. Last tactic is making smarter service choices, and this comes back again to a little bit more of the soft skills. This is why we need to be closer to the business and we need to be educators, because the service choice is absolutely critical. In the 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of CIOs were really worried about vendor lock-in. They're freaking out about cloud services in general, because it can be really a challenge to get your data in and out. But there are services that have embraced that concept of fluidity, that they're not trying to lock you in, and they make it very simple and very easy to get data in and out, right? So the major cloud service providers are a great example. They all have some way to get data in and out very, very easily. AWS is a good example. They will ship you a giant server that holds a petabyte that you can either put data on or pull data out of their services based on that. And in fact, at the latest conference, reInvent, in the just before Christmas, they actually announced now for some locations they have a tractor trailer where it has almost an exabyte of data storage space that will drive up to your location, either with your data or to take data away. So, and the other cloud service providers are following suit. Very, very key when you're onboarding onto a new service. Make sure there's an easy way to get data in and out. And you also want to make sure that there's some sort of scriptability or programmability, ideally supporting one of the standard APIs that are developing. But right now, more common APIs are probably a more realistic goal. But there needs to be some way to programmatically access a bunch of this stuff. And again, when it comes to cloud service providers, reputation is critical. They live and die on reputation because they're billing by the hour, right? Or for SaaS services, they're billing by the month. Gone are the days of signing a 3-year contract with somebody for an IT service and then you having to deal with that because you've already put your money in and you can't get it out. Now, if you're not happy with the service, you just change providers next month, especially if it's easy to get data in and out. So it's a race for customer service excellence. It's a race for reputation. That's a win for us as users. So make sure you're making smart service choices. So to wrap up here, if we look at our goal when it comes to this new world is to answer the question, where's my data? And that's surprisingly simple, a question that has a very, very difficult answer. And then from a security perspective, we want to make sure that it's adequately secured. For that data, so for PII, is it sitting on a service within the EU boundaries that falls under GDPR, right? Is it meeting those regulatory requirements for that type of data? For something that's public information, there's a different set of requirements. But the idea here is knowing where your data is, knowing what the requirements to protect that data are, and making sure that it's adequately secured. The business, however, has a simpler idea and a simpler goal, and that's just get stuff done, right? They need to get stuff done, and they need to go fast as possible because their competitors are going as fast as possible. We need to reconcile that, and the way that we're going to start today with tactics, the direct tactics, keeping in mind our bigger strategy of being friendlier and modernizing the way we approach security. But today's tactics are, you're going to reduce that exposure, and that's making sure you're making smart service choices. You're making sure that you're onboarding the right things at the right time. You're doing some centralized monitoring. And if you start with those three areas, you're going to see some immediate gains. And that's really what this is all about, is making sure that you're making immediate gains, making sure that you're aware of what's going on within your organization, because it is just that easy. It's a credit card and a 5-minute sign-up, and there's a new risk to the organization, but there's also a new opportunity, and you want to make sure that that's more an opportunity than a risk, and you do that by breaking down those silos, making sure your security teams are working with the business. And I know that's always hard for technical people to hear, because it's easier for us to say, well, if I just deploy this technology, or if I buy this box, or if I subscribe to this service, I'll solve the problem. I'd say 80 to 90% of simplifying your security when it comes to hybrid and multi-cloud, it's the soft skills. It's being an educator. It's being an advocate for the users. It's working directly with your developers and operations. It's working directly with the business units. It's no longer standing off. We have to step up to the plate and realize we're a critical part of the business. Then we can start to dive into the technology side and the sort of the easier, the more fun side. That's where we get things like centralized monitoring. That's where we start to tie things in through standard APIs and getting data in and out, and making sure that we're buying and using and rolling out controls that cover multiple services at once. We can't do that one-of anymore. We need to make sure we're reducing our overhead. These are the areas where you want to start. It's a continuing discussion. The exciting thing about the world of cloud services is that things are always changing. But realistically, even for the most advanced organizations, unless you just started doing business today, everybody's essentially in the same boat, where even if you stood up on stage at reInvent or at Microsoft Build or at Google Next and your CEO said, we are all in on the cloud, it's still going to take 18 months or longer, 18 months at the best case scenario, to move assets in. And the reason is that those assets are sitting somewhere now and they're working. So why would you tear them down if you have an existing investment that's paying off, right? So we are going to be dealing with hybrid cloud for a while. We are going to be dealing with multi-cloud for even longer. So think of a strong strategy. Hopefully this has started to get you on the right track, and start implementing some tactics today to lay the framework and to lay the groundwork so that you can be successful moving forward. Thank you very much, and now we'll switch over to do some Q&A.